So, Fari Bradley is an Iranian-born sound artist whose practice involves sound sculpture, installation, performance, and broadcast. With a background in classical and North Indian music, Bradley uses found materials, handmade electronics for improvisation, performance, and recorded works. Collaborating on large-scale pieces, Bradley composes with graphic scores or improvisational methods for site-specific work. Her solo shows and joint practice as Bradley Weaver include commissions from London Architecture Week, V&A, South London Gallery, Art Dubai, Beirut Arts Centre, Lahore Biennial Foundation, Malja, Bahrain and Tashkeel Dubai. On UK's art music radio station, Resonance 104.4 FM, from 2004 to 2019, Bradley explored MENASA, art and culture through her weekly shows Six Pillars, and until 2016, fringe dance genres on Saturday nights, Free Lab Radio. And Fari's also published in loads and loads of different platforms in Oxford Handbooks, Ibraz, The Wire, Artiste, Canvas Magazine. I could go on, but maybe I should stop there, Fari, and just hand it over to you at this point. So thank you and welcome, and please just share the screen or take over, whatever you need to do.
Okay. I like the way you made MENASA sound like a menace. The MENASA. Yeah, it's you told me that the students, it was either you or Annie said that the students will have already probably researched my work beforehand, so I thought I wouldn't talk about my work as if you were hearing about it from the first time. I would instead look at a couple of aspects of my work. Can you see that okay? Great,
Yeah.
thank you, Michael. Yeah, so I thought I would look at a couple of aspects of my work and just not bore everyone with the same details all over and over again. Also, I've spoken at CRiSAP, visiting practitioner series before. Oh, it's not CRiSAP, is it? It's the Sound Arts Department, yeah. And hosted a film there. So I'm just going to look at two aspects of my work with that in mind. One is about the feminism that runs through my work and where it's come from. I'm not going to analyse it in great detail, I just thought it would be interesting to look at. And also sketching. I thought that's something that's very pertinent to me and perhaps to you all as students, developing your own voices and signatures, if you like. So in my work, both oral and silent, I thought we'd look at that. And when I say silent, I mean sculptural works about sound. So let's begin with a sketch. So this is a sketch an audience member handed us in Beirut Arts Centre in Lebanon when we'd done a performance there. We were on a residency with Beirut Arts Centre, and I thought, how beautiful, you know, everyone else is photographing and here's somebody who's sketched us. So the reason I was interested in that is because very much part of my PhD is practice as research. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see better. So sketching as a process of formation, of perception. And I was thinking, how does a sound artist and improviser archive their sketches? And I was thinking about words like sketchbook, phenomenology, encounter, reflection, reflexivity, intersubjectivity, which I suppose is another word for intersectionality, free writing. And I was looking for some, as I always do, I was reverse engineering my thought process. So I was looking for some theory around this, and I found this next two quotes, which I'm going to show you, describing sketchbooking as a sort of methodology influenced by phenomenology. So Nigel Power in the biggest Thai university published this book, Reimagining the Sketchbook as a Medium of Encounter, in 2018, and he interviewed somebody who was teaching in arts department who said, we still require students to use sketchbooks, but the truth is we have no time to integrate them really in teaching or in assessing the development of ideas. We might as well weigh them. So it was interesting to think of the arts being taught in a way in which your thinking, your working out, as they call it in mathematics, is no longer part of the learning or the assessing. And that's sad, really. And with that in mind, I was thinking, what could you argue that the use of the sketchbook was? So Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a great philosopher, has a series of lectures that have been published called The World of Perception. It was translated from French in 2004. And in the introduction, Thomas Baldwin said about Merleau-Ponty's thinking that in his world, perception is not a fact within the world, since it's the flaw in this great diamond of the world, because perception is the capacity whereby there is a world. It cannot just be yet another fact within that world. So perception's got this special status as the root of human understanding of the world. The perceived world is the real world, as compared with which the world of science is just an approximation, i.e. a sort of superficial surface appearance. And that really appealed to me, the sort of the validifying, if you like, of subjectivity over science, which is sort of turning popular thought on its head in academia, I guess. But in the arts, that's a very relevant standpoint. And then John Berger, the great John Berger, has published a book looking at Bento's sketches, Bento's sketchbook, and in the summary, in the conclusion, he says there is a symbiotic desire to get closer and closer to enter the self of what is being drawn, and simultaneously there is the foreknowledge of an imminent distance. Such drawings aspire to be both a secret rendezvous and an au revoir, alternatively going on ad infinitum. So the closer you get to your subject with a sketching, the more you realise you're separate from it. And in that way, for me, fine art is parallel in a way to improvised performance, because in music and sound, we all know it's a linear subject, a linear genre, medium, and improvising for me was a way of coming into sound through classical music training, and the time. I think time is the sort of capturing of time, the passing of time, the being aware of time passing. It's where sketches and improvising meet. So here are some sketches I did while I was on residency in the UAE, and I think I was trying to sort of undo the classical music learning I had and become more playful with the format. And soon after that, I went to Bahrain on a residency, and we collaborated. I have a joint practice in part with Christopher John Weaver. And we were playing with a bouzouki player from Bahrain, Maxime Meraki, and I'm playing a Rhodes piano in this. And I think it was just interesting for us all to move away from classical music scores. We had no score, in fact. We were just listening to each other as improvisers do. So I'll play you a bit of that. Okay, so that's going to be, I'm going to put that on Bandcamp, I think, for Bradley Weaver, because I realise that as that goes on, it's quite long, the improvisation takes less of a sort of solitary three people moving along parallel together and becomes more merged, and in that it's a very interesting listening experience. So in terms of sketchbooks, if they are, as they are called, a sort of a meeting space which allows for the development of highly distinctive ways, affording the development of idiosyncratic visual languages and logics and highly personalised use patterns. And that's a quote from the Nigel Power book I mentioned before. If that's the case for sketchbooks, what's it for sound artists? You know, what is it when we are noodling? You know, what's the word we use? We use terms like sketching, improv, noodling. And moving away from the classical score has been a theme in my work enduringly. So this is 2016, actually, that's a mistake, it's not 2015. It was shown at Habib University in Karachi and involves a found frame that I found out there. And I'm going to show you the photographs, because in Pakistan I took about over 1,000 photographs, some really good quality ones, which I printed out as huge posters, as totems, for an exhibition that I did at the Edge of Arabia in London, called Close to Karachi. And I went backwards looking at this finished work to think, where had I been looking through the lens and through the car window on my travels around Karachi that had influenced me to create this work. And this is very interesting for me to pull these out of my archive. So this is the market where I bought the work. It contains items from UK. So this one is got $1.99. The sticker was on it, and travelled all the way to this market. So lots of things that would have been in UK charity shops and so on, vintage shops, items that you couldn't find anymore here, I guess, had travelled all the way out there, and then I was buying them and bringing them back for my show in a kind of act of reclamation, of return. I loved the market because there were literally no straight lines in it, there's no solid structure. It was very hectic. We had to devise a kind of way of buying whereby we as foreigners weren't near the thing that we wanted to buy at the time, and someone else could bid for us, otherwise we wouldn't get it at any good price. And then this is a very common sight in Karachi, a port town, a lot of sort of Viennese overtones, a lot of interesting lines, very dilapidated buildings in states of disuse, terrible wiring, perilous electrics between the lighting and the powers for powering of each building, stalls that are just people who've brought up carts from probably the villages for the day, and then they go back at the end, or they sleep somewhere and they set up again the next morning. So things like that where you could just buy one pencil. There's more of the wires, and those are black kites which hover like kestrels over the city. Their call is described as a shrill whinny, and they feed off the rubbish. But they would originally have not been obviously over urban spaces. They would have been over wetlands, marshlands, and things like that. But the habitat's depleted. So for me, those are the kind of things that I saw that led me to this kind of score. And I was thinking also about visualizing sound as an improviser. So when you're improvising, a lot of the time you're not worried at all about what you look like, you're not performing as such. And the Resonance Radio Orchestra from Resonance FM, the studio, the station, was founded by London Musicians Collective, and one of those people was Knut Alferman. And look at this, I've quoted from an MA Sonics Arts dissertation, which should, gear you all up for writing better in your dissertation. You never know when you're going to be quoted. And he wrote, "The music's an offering to the audience, not a show. It encourages communication rather than consumption." And he quotes Daniel Charles, who described the coupling between the audience and the performers as the climax of the performance, not necessarily in volume or in speed, but in the place where they come together to experience collective time. So again, time, this sense of time within performance and free sketching and improvising. That's us at the Beaconsfield Art Gallery. We're responding to works by Bob and Roberta Smith. You can see his handwriting or his hand painting, his cursive handwriting there. So I looked at some sketches I had done, digital works that obviously don't go into a sketchbook. So I was trying to deconstruct the score, think about cityscapes, and this is a sketch for something that turned out to be a huge Perspex cassette box that was empty, with liner notes that suggested sounds that weren't ever played, they just play out in the mind. And I was thinking about what other kinds of sort of performance visuals and evading visuals in a way, evading this sense of visualizing sound and focusing people on the oral had I worked on in that period. And Dubai is a very visually led society. It's very judgmental that way. I mean, like most urban societies, I guess. And we did these performances where we hid the audience in different ways. So we put the audience behind a wall for this one, but tried other means of obscuring their vision so that they would listen better. And the performers could also be free to explore their bodies. It becomes a very corporeal performance for the choir, who were feral. They were not trained, but I worked with them over several months to devise a way for them to sing and play with the sounds of the building. that's available online somewhere if you're interested to see where that's going. So another thread that I'd been pulling through in this talk was of the feminist perspectives that appear in my work, and something that arose for me was that as a woman, often we're seen as a kind of subliminal noise, or seen and not heard, or heard but not listened to, if you liked. And I try to think about where has this shown up. Sometimes it's in the materiality of the work, the gestures I use in my work. So this is a very quick work. I made it very quickly. I kind of jump in and I make it as I visualized it. And I used stitching in a very loose way for this, but it's got a lot of background sketches that went into it. The stones obviously holding it down were something new, but the sketches were all digital until this work appeared. It was shown as part of a solo show I had in 2019 when I was about 8 months pregnant, called Hearing on Mute, which was about silent sound and sounds that you hear within your own mind, and ways we hear and see at the same time. So these are sketches that I made in Abu Dhabi, again using camera as a sketching tool, and I was working towards a commission for Harper's Bazaar Arabia, where I got an artwork on the last page, and so I was trying to think about how I could address the sounds that we hear and are familiar with in the city and the way we listen. And I was looking obviously at architecture, often taking photos through the window of a car. So much of UAE is like America, it's very drive-by. And so eventually the work that went in to Harper's Bazaar Arabia was something I felt that would speak to people in the UAE visually. So this is the contribution that I gave with the front cover next to it. So that's my work on the right. And for a lot of people in the UAE, that's a familiar sight, you know, a mosque right next to high-rise buildings and playing out 5 times a day, and you're waiting at the traffic lights and you hear these things. So I was thinking about the environment, you know, what are my subtexts? Why do I make work? And that comes through in my sketchbooks quite a lot, and often I am reaching for the subtext to come forward and to be, you know, like the second layer of the work that someone would hopefully grasp listening or observing the work. So this is a sketch I made of the aftermath of a performance, and I've put a score, like a musical lines there, and tried to work out on which note does my work resonate, what am I making work for. And when I get really cross with myself, I make sketches like this. Just out of impatience. This idea of the feminist thread in my work probably stems from always being an other. So I was thinking, in what ways have I always been an other? I've always been either the token girl or the token brown girl. I've also been the token tourist or the token resident. I've been many kinds of others, and I had listed them, I haven't written them down. And so I was thinking about where had the inclusion come from for me? When had I been encouraged by these groups that I supposedly belong to on ethnic minority forms? My ethnicity is never there. I always have to tick other. It's just what I identify with, really. This probably comes from an era before those ethnic minority forms. It was 2006. It was a 3 CD pack, all handmade with touch contacts on the packs. You can see them inside the flower there, and I flew to America to launch it, and there were some great people on it, like Cozy Fanny Tutti and Priya Ray, the daughter of Satyajit Ray, and we were exploring noise, anti-music, if you like, and performance improvisation, and a lot of us had ecology at the forefront of our thinking. And one of the few tracks, I've submitted several tracks to this, so one of the 3 tracks I submitted was this one, which is called Gathering. I think it's going to play. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I think that is available online as well. So another forum in which I was able to sketch a lot was through digital releases. Obviously, you can. A lot of my work's commission based, so there's a big emphasis on the result and the context of the result. Whereas, I think gallery artists often make works to fill a show. So I don't have a gallery or anything like that, or a label as such. So I created this symbol out of English weave, Persian weave, and Indian. I've spent more than 5 years of my life in India and studied classical Indian music out there. And so these were things that I felt really brought together some of who I was, and I used that symbol to create an online identity called Asian Filter. I mean, I haven't uploaded most of the stuff I've done with that, just a few as tests for fun. And I was able to explore in this something I couldn't fully explore in I had a radio show for many years looking at Middle Eastern arts and culture, so I could learn about my own culture, which I left when I was about 3 and had no real connection with, as my father, I never knew my father, or he never came, and I assimilated very quickly into British culture and no family over here really. So Asian Filter was a way to look at this, for example, is looking at the oil production in Iran, how it's transported and how it's mined with the flames, and I made this video piece as a sort of accompaniment to a track I did called Camel Caramella, so you can see a bit of that here. In that work I used a neon piece that I'd created for a solo show I did in Dubai called Stitches to Save 9 with, and the electric light refers to its own materiality about the neon casting no shadows in paradise. It's a rhetorical question, so I'm interested in interweaving my work that way. And this is another piece I made for the same show, Stitches to Save 9 with, in Dubai, where I created an installation using these found objects, which were these aprons in skin tones with my handwriting as weave. I often use my handwriting in stitching, and so it's installed like that, as if women finished working, they hang up their aprons and go home, and the different the sort of disparate handwritings form this bit of a poem, obviously referencing the metaphysical poet John Donne, No Man is an Island unto Himself, which was interesting because around that time Trump was coming in, and this idea of Europe being isolated with Brexit and all those things that were in the pipeline. Another work I made, which I think for which feminism was definitely part of the thread, was this radio installation where I imagined a radio station 24/7 for women, by women and for women, as opposed to sort of the 1 hour afforded by the BBC, the same kind of tokenistic thing as you have with Women's Day, and named it This Woman's Word. Found the radio in a market again. And this hung beside it. This is an object of nuisance, which was a commission, like the radio piece, for a show called The Art of Nuisance, from the Sisters of Perpetual Resistance. The piece is called Dirty Dirty Tuba. It's again a found object, and I created a sort of cleansing ritual to treat the materiality, but that's another story as to why I did the cleansing ritual. But for our cause, I should say, like, to compare the meticulous sort of ritual I'd created against the sound. The sound was made in a very irreverent way, as an object of nuisance. And I'd been living when I made this. I just come back from the UAE, where obviously in the Middle East, in those regions, there's no space for protest. So to be suddenly called on to create this was a good challenge for me. It was a good shock to come back. And obviously I was, at the end of the show, we had a march where we took all of our instruments, and I was testing it here. So I'm playing it for some police who have stopped at traffic lights on their way to a anti-austerity march at the time. So I'm not going to read you the next text, but you can have a look at this Guardian article extract to understand what I was doing with the tuba here.
Just to jump in here, Fari, just to let you know, we've got about 5 to 10 minutes max.
That's great. Yeah, and I've got my timer going.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, so the text talks about time disappearing, the names for female body parts that I've polished out on the silver of the tuba, fading, and also the idea of the police seeing me in this way. Being an Iranian, you're very self-aware about things like backpacks on train stations, your passport when you go through customs. I'm often given extra searches, like my skirt and whatever. And then to stand there with that balaclava on, which is a issue from the Sisters of Perpetual Resistance, was a bit of a scary thing. But as I say in the article, they waved at me and I felt confident that they wouldn't hurt anyone at the march and things would be okay, because kettling had just started around then. So in terms of the sound that I put, the irreverent sound inside the tuba, I'd been very influenced by this CD, which turned up at Resonance FM about 2007, maybe 6, 7. And it's by a Lebanese trumpeter called Mazen Kabad. She's an improviser, and he's playing on this CD as bombs are falling in Lebanon. And when I later met him and I said, "Oh, I've always loved your CD," he said, "Oh, no one ever pronounces it properly. I'm really amazed you did that." And then over the years we've met many times, and I've ended up being on his CD, which released this year. It's actually a double vinyl. That came out in Berlin, and he gave us many samples of his non-playing of the trumpet, and I created a very polished piece for that. So we're just going to hear an excerpt of that, and I'm going to compare it to the sound that I did for the tuba, which is not at all polished. Okay, so in retrospect, I found an artist who, a musician who was making similar sounds with his tuba. I wish I'd known about it at the time, but things are just so much easier in retrospect. And he had made some great tuba feedback. I'm referring to the 2016 piece that I'm going to play you in a minute from Dirty Dirty Tuba. At the time, I felt the curator of the show was annoyed that my tuba was sounding so annoying, and it was going on and on in the space. And I said to her, "You did ask me to make an object of nuisance, and it's an audio nuisance, and when we march, it's going to have an impact, and I'm going to play it while it's also playing the digital file. I'll be able to blow through it at the same time." But she was upset. And this is Bora Molstad, what he's done with tuba feedback. So you get the idea. It's quite similar to what Mazen Kabaj does with his trumpet. Sometimes he deconstructs the trumpet, he'll add a balloon instead of one part of it, and so on. So in my, the red cloth hides the electronics, and you can see the word fallopian and over there. this is the sounds that I had coming out of it. I went to record my sister, who was training to be an opera singer at Guildhall at the time, and got all of her and her friends to laugh maniacally in an operatic way so I could record it, because I had this idea that I was going to overlay it with the sound of machine gun fire. I wish I had known about artists like Bora Molstad, but I only heard his work last week. So it validifies this, which so we're coming to the end now. I think that's a piece, although it sounds very funny, it's about war for me, and also like, being heard over the din, the power of female derision in a male-dominated world, and things like that. So where am I now with my work? So I'm on my PhD. Part-time, I took time out. I took almost a year out to have a baby, and then there was lockdown. But just before I had the baby, I had that solo show, and I started again to pick up sort of quick stitching as a sketch. And I had 2 works side by side. One is a dayscape, one is a night soundscape. And these are the sounds I can hear from my window sometimes, like a car alarm. I'm not sure if you can see that. Fight, owl, I often hear an owl, the aeroplanes and so on, and my daughter would say often, you know, Mummy, what's that sound? And I would have to tell her. So it was an interesting way to sketch the night that way. And I guess all of these works, just to sum up, were sort of at the root of my PhD question, which is this: new ears for new noise. How might sound art interrogate signal density in smart cities as noise pollution? So there's a paradoxical question at the bottom of that, which is really, if we haven't learned to listen to the voice within ourselves and the sounds that go on inside our mind, how will we be able to take note of disruption to that voice, a new kind of noise pollution, as subtle as it might be? Thank you for listening, and if you want to not jot down any question you have, because we're going to answer them at the end, apparently. Is that the end?
That was incredibly generous and rich and very inspiring, and I've got to say it's lovely as well to hear these works through glorious stereo in Zoom. There's a bit of hope there for the medium, I think. Yeah, there's questions in the chat, and but we're going to go to Hannah next, and then we'll sort of do the Q&A all together in one go. So I'll read Hannah's bio, and then Hannah, I'll just hand it over to you. So Hannah Kemp Welch is a sound artist with a socially engaged practice. She produces audio works with community groups for installation and broadcast using voices, field recordings, and found sounds. Hannah also delivers workshops, makes zines, and builds basic radios, aiming to open out sonic practices and technologies for all. Hannah is a member of the feminist radio art group Shortwave Collective, an arts cooperative sound camp. And Hannah has exhibited at Art Genie, Further Field, John Hansard Gallery, there's lots and lots of these, again, Kettle's Yard, Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, Nottingham Contemporary. I won't keep listing these, but you can check them out on Hannah's website as well. And Hannah is, like Fari, a current PhD student, although at different parts of the timeline, studying at CRiSAP, where Hannah is developing and testing methods for collective listening and socially engaged art. And I'm so chuffed that you can do this today, Hannah. So over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. What an amazing presentation by Fari as well. Thank you. My mind is slightly blown. I'm processing. Really interesting. I'm going to talk really about two projects that I have that I worked on during lockdown, and really they led me to this research question, which I have been thinking about in my PhD project, which I started about 6 months ago. I have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes about each project to really kind of unpack the kind of the thinking and the problems within it, and how that sort of informed the research that I'm doing now. It's really, I guess, a little bit from a different field. So I kind of see my practice as being across socially engaged art and sound art, in the way that I worked for I finished my MA. I did my MA in sound arts at CRiSAP in 2010. And when I left, I went pretty much straight into working as a community artist. So I worked for museums and galleries, primarily working with children, young people and community groups. And that is really kind of like the great enjoyment that I get from artistic practice and artistic inquiry, working with other people and collaborating. And, you know, some of the work that I've been doing has got quite an activist turn to it. And a lot of what I think about is like, which bit of this is the art? And the medium that I use is audio. And so, you know, I make work which uses sound, but I don't always think it is sound art. A lot of it for me is about listening. A lot of it for me is about the voice. But I think for other people, it could be about other things. So I'm going to start to unpick some of those and just use two case studies of two projects that I worked on recently to think about those things. So my supervisor is Professor Kathy Lane, who is obviously excellent, who I'm sure most of you know, and also Dr. Nella Millick, who's thinks about kind of critical and theoretical practices, also based at LCC. Before I launch into talk about projects in my research, I think maybe it's important as well to say, I guess maybe to tell us a story. One of you get given advice by sage ex-PhD students when you first start to do your PhD, which is, you know, super, super welcome. And the two major pieces of advice that I got and followed: number one, get a dog. I currently have a sleeping puppy next to me. And number two, if you are doing a practice-based PhD, then have an artistic practice that is not connected to your PhD as well, which you can retreat into at times. Because your PhD can start to feel like work, and then your hobby becomes your work. And so it's good to have a bit of a division. So along along those lines, I'm just going to tell you very quickly about two other kinds of artistic work that I do. One of them is as part of where, but basically both of these things are collective collaborative projects. The first is with a group called Sound Camp. So we're an arts cooperative, which is formed of Grant Smith, Dawn Scarf, Maria Papadomonolaki, I think I got that right, and some other ex-CRiSAP people. And we run a kind of annual festival that's coming up in a couple of weeks, which is like a micro festival that happens for International Dawn Chorus Day, where we invite people around the world to live stream the sound of the Dawn Chorus in their area, and then we spend 25 hours moving a lot around the globe with the sun, following the kind of the daybreak around the world, and pick up and live these microphones and broadcast them on Resonance Extra and Pinot and a couple of other platforms. And alongside that, we commission artistic workshops. People go on bat walks, people camp out. It's coming up in a couple of weeks, so do join us. It's going to be in Stave Hill Ecological Park in Rotherhithe in London. So it's like basically a free, really nice sound art hippie festival where we think about transmission ecologies and spend some time in nature and think about sound art and do things like build radios together. So do come if you can. I'll put a link in the chat before the end of the session today. And I'm also in quite a new venture, which we started really during lockdown, where I, for a while, I basically have really old man hobbies. You know, if you think about the typical hobbies of granddads, those are my hobbies. I'm into train spotting, building homemade radios, those kinds of things. And I guess I, in some ways, see that as my feminism, to try and like reclaim some of those things and think about them in new ways. And one of the things that I really wanted to do was to get my amateur radio license, which was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done. It involved learning so much physics, none of which I remembered from school. But I learned a bit about the physics of radio circuits, and tried to run a workshop to teach other women about these things in a much more accessible way than the way that I was taught. And some really cool women came to this workshop, and we decided that we were going to set up a little collective where we'd keep learning together, and that we would set up a sort of monthly making session where we'd get together on Zoom and try and build a radio, or we would try and learn together, thinking about the radio spectrum as like an artistic material that we could use. So we set up this collective, and since then, actually, we started to work on lots of projects and commissions. We did a residency in Portugal last year where we developed designs for homemade radios, which use galena crystals and are kind of very flexible and can be attached to different kind of still and static objects. So we built radios into buildings, like around roof tiles. We built radios like around fences. And we are going to be running a radio building workshop for anyone who wants to join at Sound Camp. But we also had our designs for these radios published in a kind of California tech bro magazine called Make Magazine. Got a copy around here somewhere. And we were also working on lots of commissions which think about listening via these sorts of homemade devices. So we're doing 22 hours of radio listening for Radio Art Zone, which is taking place in August. So kind of radio art festival based in Luxembourg. So this is our kind of collective venture where we think about making and technology and feminist practices, learning from each other, inclusive structures. And we've been working on that for a little while. So to move on to thinking about two projects that have really informed my research, which are, you know, as I say, from slightly different discipline, I think, to what we're used to talking about in sound art, but I think sound art can inform it in a really useful way. I guess the project is best told by kind of telling the story. So the story is this: someone made me a mixtape, and it was literally a mixtape on cassette. I did not own a cassette player, so I decided that I need to go to Argos and go and buy a cassette player. But when I got to Argos, there were like 3 different cassette players. They all cost like between 10 and 20 quid. So I wanted to find out which one is the best cassette player. So in Argos, they have these little screens, and on the screens, it has customer reviews. So, you know, I kind of dutifully was reading through the customer reviews of which is the best cassette player. And I was astonished to find that every single review of the cassette player was written by somebody who had a long-term health condition or disability, and who had bought the cassette player for the purpose of recording their disability benefits assessment. Now, the system in the UK at the moment, if you have a long-term health condition or disability, is that you have to attend an assessment where someone who is not your GP or a trained health professional, someone actually from a private outsourced company called Atos Healthcare or Capita, 2 companies which have been, you know, kind of embroiled in multiple scandals, someone employed by one of these companies will basically ask you a series of very bureaucratic questions, most of which have yes or no answers, despite which are required, despite the fact that your health condition might be much more complex than that. So they'll ask you all these questions about your health condition, and they will ask you to perform what you can and can't do. So they will say, for example, if you have come in on 2 crutches, they might say, we would like you to stand on tiptoes. Now, obviously, you know, as you can hear, this is for many people incredibly anxiety-inducing, offensive, stressful, humiliating, as a process to have to go into a room and perform your disability to someone who is not your GP, to someone who is from some private company that actually is making profit from their government contract to fulfill these assessments for people. So disabled people have to go through this process in order to have access to the money that they're entitled to, this system that we call benefits, although of course that's a highly loaded term. What we're talking about here is social security payments. So we have these people with long-term health conditions, and they have to go to this assessment. The assessments are notoriously corrupt as a process. There's been lots of exposés and investigative journalism that shows that the assessors lie, that the assessors inaccurately report on what happens during the assessments, and that there are quotas that they have to fulfill for the amount of people that they have to refuse. And refusing someone's access to social security payments has massive repercussions on their life. If you are suffering from a long-term health condition and you are not able to work, to then have all of your money stopped could mean that you're no longer able to eat and pay rent. It can, shove you from on the poverty line to so far below it that you are now, evicted, homeless, etc. So some activists fought long and hard for disabled people to have the right to have an audio recording made of their assessment. And that was, a victory which was really important, because if you have an audio recording of what happens at your benefits assessment, if someone lies in the assessment or if they inaccurately report what happens, you then have evidence of that. And then you can appeal against the decision and take it to a tribunal, where then at tribunal level, they can, reassess a decision and potentially give you back access to your social security payments, which have been denied to you. So it's really important that people now have this right to this audio recording. However, in a cynical move, these companies have ruled that the only legitimate way that you can audio record your benefits assessment is by providing 2 identical cassette players and recording on cassette. So the system is that you go to your benefits assessment, you, the claimant who has no money and various access needs, probably because of your health condition, you have to provide yourself these 2 identical cassette players. The cassettes have to be already wrapped in plastic packaging. They can't be open already. And then you have to set up the gear. You have to have PAT tested extension cables of a certain meterage, no shorter, no longer. You have to go through all this bureaucracy, and you have to source the equipment yourself. You then have to press play during the assessment, and then at the end of the assessment, you press stop on the recording gear. You immediately give 1 copy of the cassette to the benefits assessor, and you can take 1 copy home. So that's the current system. And the reason that they say that it has to be done on cassette, you can't just take your phone in, is because somehow they imagine that if you were to just make the recording on your phone, you would somehow be able to invisibly, without the assessor seeing, somehow take your phone off your desk and underneath the desk, download a DAW and suddenly edit out the words that you don't want from the recording in real time as it's happening, and then resave the file in the same way. And obviously that's not going to happen. So basically, they've created this pretext by which the government and these companies claim that cassette tape is the only unimpeachable method of providing audio evidence. Now, we of course know that this is completely not true. You could just email the recording, that you make on your phone to the assessors right at the end in front of them before, anything could happen. But this is the excuse that they're giving. So I was appalled by this because, it costs, I think the calculation that I did was it cost basically 130 quid to get 2 cassette players, to get the tapes, to get the extension cable, to get the box in which everything will stay safe and secure. And it doesn't even work. All of these Argos, reviews were basically from heartbroken people saying, I bought 2 cassette tapes, 2 cassette players for my benefits assessment. It ate the tape. The hiss from it was so loud that then you couldn't even hear what was happening. They made me put the cassette recorder miles away from where we were sitting, so you couldn't even hear our voices. So, this corrupt system is massively affecting people's lives, and the argument seems to be around recording. So as someone very invested in sound and listening, and also I have, in my 20s, I had a long-term health condition, which meant that I had to also go through this process of applying for disability benefits to support me with the costs of living with a health condition. I felt personally really angry at this and like something needed to be done. At the same time, I had just been given a commission for, a significant budget attached by a gallery to make pretty much any artwork that I wanted, as long as it engaged with a local community in a particular area of London. This gallery had they'd been really embedded in this community and been doing really good work in this community for like 16, 17 years. And so they had established some really good links with, I might actually stop sharing my screen so you can see my face whilst I'm talking rather than staring at the same photo, because I'm probably going to talk about this project for another 5 minutes. So this community organisation, this community arts organisation, had been working in this community for a really long time. So they had some really strong links with people and had been, kind of doing good work there for a while. So I asked them to help me to do some outreach to people who with long-term health conditions, who had applied for this benefit, who lived in the local area, and who were willing to share their testimonies with me. Lots of people responded, and we formed this kind of project group of people with long-term health conditions who were really annoyed by this system and who wanted to make a change happen. And we started to meet every week. And the first thing that I did, it was lockdown, we were meeting online, is that I sent via post cassette recorders and cassettes to every member of the group. And I made little zines, and I made little audio recorded cassettes, and I sent out kind of creative prompts to people for ways to explore with the quality of the tape, and for ways that we could kind of play with this system of kind of postal exchanges of cassette tapes. So we did this for a little while, and we hated playing with the cassette tape and these cheap £10 Argos recorders. It seemed to really infuriate people, but there was also this kind of playfulness with it. And these various kind of creative ideas for how we would respond to this situation started to emerge from the group. One of them was that one of the participants really wanted to wrap herself in the cassette tape. She has a prosthetic leg, and she wanted to wrap her leg in the cassette tape and to bind herself, and for someone to come and take photos of her bound in the cassette tape to kind of show this sort of symbolic tying that she felt was happening within this process. Some other members of the group were really interested in exploring poetry and spoken word, and as I am an audio producer of types, then I was really keen for us to kind of do an activist campaign that would in some way be captured as a kind of audio documentary of sorts. So as part of, we were determined that we were going to change this system. And so we did the usual stages that you would go through to try and change government policy. We went along to APPG meeting, so that's an all parliamentary group meeting, and we lobbied. We wrote lots of very formal and well-researched letters to the government, to all the Tories who are involved with special interest groups to do with benefits, and to all the shadow cabinet. And we had online meetings with MPs. We met with this woman called Vicky Foxcroft from Labour, who is a shadow minister for disabled people. And we asked her to table parliamentary questions to inquire why this system requires the use of cassette tape rather than any other medium for recording. So, we got involved with this kind of activist process of lobbying, and we also invited local other disabled activists to come and meet with us and to talk with the group about strategies that they'd found successful in campaigning. And we kind of documented this process as an audio documentary. And I'm just going to play you a little snippet, an extract from it, which is about 5 minutes long. Let's return over here so that I can do that. Let's do a bit of share screen, share sound, slideshow. Here we go.
The right to record. The right to record. After I lost my leg, for obvious reasons, I applied for PIP.
The mobility car was my freedom. I don't have that anymore.
My money was something I relied on. They just totally stopped it and said, no, that's it.
A lot of them, they just lie. They'll say that you've said something and you haven't said that at all.
And I lived on £18 a week. It was a struggle to do that.
This programme is made by a collective of Barking and Dagenham residents who have had long-term health conditions and disabilities. This is our campaign against illegal action that discriminates against us and prevents many from getting access to the financial support they need to live with a health condition.
Faceless assassins. They lie to your face and then they lie on paper. Without an ounce of compassion, we are all a mere distraction. They ignore abilities the same way they ignore disabilities. They've never given a damn about what we have to say.
The very first time I applied for PIP was back in 2013. It was after a serious car incident. I was run over and I had to wear a tailor spatial frame on my left leg for 6 months, then had it removed in January, but like it was held together by pins and rods. I had to use a commode. I couldn't get about because of the damage to my leg. So there's things I couldn't do physically for myself, and I was wheelchair bound. I had to be washed and bathed due to my injuries. I was suffering with depression and post-traumatic stress. Well, I applied for PIP in these very early stages and they knocked me back. Didn't even call me in for an assessment, nothing, just said point blank no.
The government has outsourced benefits assessments. We want to evoke a legal right to audio record our interactions with these companies.
The government has ruled that cassette tape is the only form of legitimate audio evidence. So we are recording this show on cassette tape in the hope this encourages the government to hear us. We hope you enjoy the squeaky and hissy textures of the show.
I've recorded on the tape recorder and listening back, there's an high level of hissing and the voices are very low on the tape recorder. So you're missing a lot.
So we are recording this show on cassette tape in the hope this encouraging the government to hear us. We hope you enjoy the squeaky and hissy textures of the show.
On the 8th of April 2013, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition introduced a new benefit called Personal Independence Payment, known as PIP.
Personal Independence Payment, PIP, has replaced Disability Living Allowance for people of working age. PIP is a benefit designed to help towards some of the extra costs arising from having a long-term health condition or disability to help people lead full, active and independent lives. PIP is assessed on how your condition affects your daily life, not the condition you have. As part of your claim to PIP, you may be invited for a face-to-face assessment. This will be to gather additional details alongside the information you already provided. This will take place in an assessment centre or in your own home.
I applied 4 times and got kicked back every time. And on the 5th time, I actually got to go and see them. I'd written out about my illness, my legs, and what I can and can't do with them. I'd suffering from mental health for quite a while, anxiety, depression, panic, anger. So as soon as anger was mentioned, it was a case of, you can't have an home visit. So what they'll do is have a first appointment for me. So as soon as I open the doors, I should be getting seen. Now this time, because of the getting there, my anxiety and panic was getting, but also my anger was rising. So then after about half hour, still nobody. And through the doors, you could see about 3 or 4 of them standing there talking. It took another half hour to get up and get seen. And there was no apology. It was the same questions that I've been asked for ESA. Again, what can I can't do, and can I show the stand up and like stand on tiptoes or lean against a wall and bend? So I said, no, I can't. I'm not doing it. I'm not a puppet. 4 to 6 weeks later, it wasn't even 2 weeks like they said, I got a reply saying, no, I'm not entitled to it. And then I read through the paperwork that come, which was about 100 odd pages. 99% of it was wrong. I got 2 sticks. And my wife was there to make sure I weren't falling. But according to when the paperwork come, I walked to the room unaided. I could do this, I could do that. I'm thinking, where did this come from? So yeah, this is the kind of thing that they do.
So, you know, in this work, what was really important to me was to think about testimony. Because to me, you know, I find testimony to be really emotional and something that is persuasive and political and important in order to archive the voices of people whose voices we don't hear very often. So I worked on a project just before this one where I went to Hiroshima in Japan and I recorded the testimonies of Hibakusha, who are the survivors of the nuclear bomb. You know, and I found that to be an incredibly moving experience and something that has really influenced my practice since then, of the kind of importance of kind of capturing people's voices in the spoken word and people who have experienced these things, and the kind of the affect that that produces in the listener to hear it from people who have been through that. So, you know, there's lots I could say about the politics of the voice within this piece. I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, really struck me when working with these voices is actually how rarely, even in 2022, we hear the voices of working class people in the media, you know, although there may be a greater diversity of voices now on radio shows, etc., you know, not enough, not enough. And when there's some interesting research that I won't go into now, but that you'll probably already sort of be aware of, to do with regional accents and how those are used. And I just thought that the kind of government extract of using the Irish woman's voice in this way was, you know, I thought, you know, interesting to reflect on in terms of how regional accents are used by kind of government and marketing purposes to make us feel safe and reassured in different ways. And, you know, of course, the role that gender plays within this as well, something that I've explored in other works, how gendered voices are in public space. So, you know, we kind of went through this like really collaborative process of making this work. It was really important to me that this was a work that was not made by me, that this was a work that I was a small part of. I was a servant to the group, and we worked together. We made all decisions together, and that went for scripting, editing, recording, the concept of the work. But also, I guess the result of that is that, you know, as you just heard, that was not really a piece of sound art, right? When you think about sound art, it doesn't sound like that. That sounds like a documentary. It sounds like a podcast, right? And it also doesn't sound like me. That's not my aesthetic. That's not what my work sound like. And I guess it got me to thinking quite a lot about the sorts of work that I do, where I collaborate with a community, and the sort of aesthetic tensions that sometimes exist between myself, a white, middle class, highly educated, art school type person, and the aesthetic that has been imprinted on me, and what I think art is and what other people think art is. And actually what we really, I felt, needed was a space where we could critically discuss aesthetics together, so that both me and the group could come out with a shared aesthetic. And instead, I don't really feel like that happened in this work. What happened in this work is we were trying to reach a mainstream audience, and therefore we kind of assumed that the mainstream audience wants sweeping pads behind their voices. It wants a clear narrative where you are led through from point A to point B in a story that is very linear. You want music, spoken word, poetry. You want, you know, I even wrote a little trap beat to go behind a part of it. And none of that stuff is stuff from my artistic practice. You know, it's something. And so that kind of left me with the question of like, which part of this whole project was the art? Because for me, I did still feel like I was making artwork, but the artwork was not the end product. I think for me, the artwork was the dialogue that I had with the group. The artwork was the process of making it. The artwork was not the activism even. And actually the activism was successful. It was an effective piece of activism where actually we did manage to get a commitment from the government that has now, 18 months later, finally been implemented, where the use of cassette players in benefits assessments has now been abandoned, you know, and that is a direct result of this work taking place and the stink that we made about it publicly. So, you know, I guess in that way, you know, we can again also think about what makes an artwork successful. Is it successful because it sounds good? Is it successful because lots of people hear it? Is it successful because the group got benefit from it? Is it successful because we made a piece of legislation change? So these were some of the questions that were sort of floating around for me. To talk about a second project, which was very different, this also took place during lockdown, and I worked on it in collaboration with Grant Smith from Kemp, partly because he's my neighbour. He actually lives like on the next road from me, so he was a very convenient person to work with during lockdown. But we were commissioned by the Albany. So the Albany is a kind of theatre/community centre down in Deptford. And they have like a long history of involvement with improvised music collectives, with activist groups. CND used to be based there, or the London region branch of CND used to be based there. But every Tuesday, the Albany host people who are over the age of 65 in a program that they call Meet Me. And Meet Me is like a kind of social care / art project for people who are at risk of social isolation, is the terminology that they use. So people who are primarily, I would say that the people who I met there were in their mid-80s to early 90s. Most of them didn't have children who lived in London or didn't have children, and actually spent, because of a variety of health conditions, spent a lot of time in isolation. And going to Meet Me on a Tuesday was a really significant event in their week, and really the kind of bright spot for them in their description of their kind of day-to-day lives. So this program comes to pick them up from their doors in an accessible minibus, and at 9 in the morning on Tuesday, and drives around Lewisham, picking up all the people who want to come. And then they sit in the Albany Theatre's cafe, and there's various tables there, and everyone has their seat that they are protective over. And they have a variety of options of activities open to them, such as knitting, such as there's a gardening club, there is a choir that they can go to. But it's really a kind of social space that is important for this group, where they, you know, meet and talk and have a kind of social space to come. So the program employs artists. So they have a different artist every month who comes and sort of offers like an optional extra, a different kind of art activity for the group to do. And me and Grant decided that we were going to do a sort of woodwork workshop for the group, where we were going to build a stream box together. So we were going to build a sort of casing for like a microphone attached to a Raspberry Pi that then broadcasts sounds live and direct to a sound map on the internet. And we were going to install this box in the garden of the Albany. And the intention here was that quite a few of the participants described anxiety about going into the garden. They said that they'd like to go into the garden, but they are worried about trips and falls. And we wanted, in that case, if people couldn't go out to the garden, to bring a bit of the garden inside. So we wanted to hook up the stream box to the PA system in the cafe so that people could hear the sounds of the garden and hopefully kind of form that connection between inside and outside. We also made bird feeders with some of the members of the group to encourage birds, and therefore the bird song that they bring, to surround the stream box, so that there would be more sound coming inside as a kind of result of that intervention. So we were midway through doing this in March 2020, and then the pandemic happened. And so suddenly we're in this position where our work is cut off and the group are sent home. And you know, as the pandemic dragged on and everyone realized like the, you know, awful effect that this was having, particularly on elders, that they were in complete isolation. Many of them didn't have any access to digital technologies. And so they were really cut off and were obviously particularly vulnerable from a health perspective as well. So we felt that we wanted to do something in order to kind of retain some sort of sense of connection for this group. And so we contacted Resonance FM and asked whether or not they'd be open to a radio program, because they broadcast in London on FM radio. And although many of these participants don't have access to the internet or digital devices, most of them have an FM radio at home. So those that didn't, we bought them a little FM radio, tuned it to Resonance FM, posted it to them, and then we started work on producing a weekly show for this group. Now, The way that we went about this is that we used landline telephones and recording gear and recording software to try and reroute landline telephone conversations via the internet so that we could record them. And we set up group conversations for like 3, 4 or more of the participants to have a chat. We recorded their chat, which they knew was public facing. And then we edited it with our own sound content. And we were really keen for sound to not be used just to illustrate what they said, but to extend the conversation. So for the sound to be like an active participant in the conversation, for the sound to extend what the group were talking about, or to comment on or to disagree with what the group were talking about. And so we used like little snippets of talks by academics. We interviewed some of our artist friends in response to certain things that the participants had said during their group phone call conversation. And we also used like live streams and found sounds and, you know, all kinds of different sort of sounds to create the show. So we made 41 episodes, which were half an hour each, and we broadcast them every Tuesday morning on Resonance FM for the group to listen to feel that sense of connection where they weren't forgetting about the other members of Meet Me and they didn't feel forgotten about, so that they could still kind of retain that sense of contact and communication with a wider group beyond just their personal friends there. So I'm going to play you what we made, which is like a sampler. It's 3 minutes long. And it's not an extract of an episode. It's little tiny snippets from a year's worth of episodes. So you can kind of get a bit of a sense or a feel for what the show was like.
Anna, we'll have to, just for time purposes, we'll have to sort of draw it up after this excerpt, if that's okay, because we need half an hour for the Q&A.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
So we're making a radio show from our homes during lockdown. We are Meet Me on the radio. Don't stop us when we're in mid-flow.
Where we moved to was on the edge of the Bristol Channel. We were smack dab in the middle of the approaching storm.
Oh, my childhood was so nice in Jamaica. We lived in a big yard. They call it a yard.
Yeah.
And there was one radio in the yard for everybody to share. Radio Fusion, it was called.
So how did you travel to England, Mum?
That year.
You can remember how much you got for your first wages?
You may know.
What?
4 shillings.
So 20 pence?
20 pence.
Oh.
Don Haraway, what is a human animal?
It puts human and animal together and makes them come inside each other.
I'm in the garden this morning with Julie, who is one of our Albany gardeners. We're going to save some tomato seeds because it's that time of year when we're thinking about saving seeds ready for our planting next spring.
And now, folks, it's time for Deptford Island Discs.
All the children used to go to Saturday cinema. Probably over 200 children would turn up at the Capitol in Forest Hill.
So this soup I'm cooking, Ron, is one of my favourites for winter.
All right.
So I'm going to wash the chicken now with lemon and vinegar.
Is it too early for me to sing carol songs next Monday?
I think it's the perfect time for you to do that.
Silent night, holy night, holy calm, holy calm.
I've had my jab, so have you had yours yet, Ron?
No.
That's because you're only a young woman, that's what it is.
That's right, Ron, young woman, yeah.
It's lovely, all the cucumbers and peppers, tomatoes, and all different kind of varieties. It's so much alive, isn't it?
So I guess to draw these threads together, Mark, I'll be 1.5 minutes, is that actually we put a lot of care into this weekly radio show, and the feedback that we got is that some of the elders hated it. They hated it. They felt like, what is happening here? What are these weird sounds? We want to hear like more sing-alongs. We just want to listen to the Beatles, which was a really difficult position to be in, because actually it turns out that our sound art aesthetic from art school was actually not of interest to this group that we had tried so hard to be of service to. And so this leads me really to my PhD research. And what I'm looking at is thinking about tensions of inequality in these kinds of collaborations between artists and community groups in this way. And I'm proposing that we can use strategies from sound art and implant them as methodologies to use in this kind of work, community art or socially engaged practice. And what I am trying to do is develop a model for critical participatory listening, where we sit down together at the beginning of a project and we listen to different cultural references that we have together, and we develop like a shared aesthetic from the start, different ways of thinking about what is art to us, what does culture mean, and what is it that we want to produce together, so that we can start to form critical dialogue to form a kind of shared or to be able to negotiate better our kind of collective aims and a kind of shared aesthetic from a point of more understanding. So my research is practice-based, and I'm going to be doing community projects where we're going to sit down and we're going to listen together, and we're going to, this is a kind of model that I'm forming, looking back at the histories of feminist consciousness raising groups, working class self-education initiatives, thinking about ways to stimulate our criticality in response to audio sources in particular. There's some key texts that I have been reading, but I'm going to leave it there because I'm super interested to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. It's really funny. I'm sort of remembering very quickly why Thursday afternoon is my favourite part of the week. These were amazing talks. So much to get into with both of them. But I think let's, Beth, are you there? Do you want to, this is Beth, the MA Sound Art student who is going to maybe pose a question first. We've got lots of questions in the chat as well, so we can work through them. But Beth, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Nice. I think there's a bit of feedback going on.
Is that okay? Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much. They were both amazing talks. I feel very inspired. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions and also some questions from some of the MEs as well. First thing I was going to ask was probably for Hannah, because I'm also interested in collective listening, especially as a form of, resistance. And you talked a bit about like positionality and stuff, but like one of the difficulties, that I kind of find is like cultivating spaces in which people can kind of feel vulnerable or feel porous enough to kind of actively listen. I was just wondering how do you go about that cultivation? Is that something that you're kind of constantly thinking about, like who's this space for and things like that? Or is it something that you kind of is better to just let organically evolve or unfold?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think that's really important. I don't know if I can say that there is a one-size-fits-all model for that. I've worked as a community artist basically for 10 years, and each group is so different and their needs are so different, and the things that will become barriers to participation and the things that will entice them to share views are also completely different and context dependent. I think definitely having a certain space and discussions about why we're doing this is really important, but the using kind of art as a vehicle to have difficult discussions is kind of core to my practice, and I don't see that as different to setting up a critical listening group. you know, you've kind of established that your aim is to collaborate to make an artwork together, and therefore everyone's going to contribute something to that artwork in some way, and therefore there will be critical discussion as that happens. I think sometimes silence can be the enemy, you know, and so to facilitate natural discussions, perhaps everybody needs to be in spaces where they feel more comfortable, and that isn't always in a white cube or in a dark room with everyone sitting in a circle. Sometimes it needs to be more informal and more flexible. And I always try and work in places where the community group are already meeting, rather than getting everyone to come to some new unknown space, as I find that that kind of creates new barriers.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually really, really helpful. I also wanted to ask Fari, you talked, you said on your website as well, I noticed, you use a lot of vocals in your work. And I also noticed you said to sing freeform is to lay oneself bare, and only then is one in a true and just position to expect the same from the listener. And that really like resonated with me. And I was wondering if like you do you look for that kind of like the same qualities, the ability to be imperfect in the materials and instruments you use as well, do you think?
Yes, I would say that's very astute. A lot of the times it's an experiment, it's a new materiality or form, and I've created things like recording studios where the whole decor inside the recording studio was to enable people to feel they could make mistakes, because glitch, I presented, me and my partner Chris Weaver, we presented glitching as a totem, we were trying to say that basically you can make a totem out of a mistake. You can make improvising is a safe space to listen and make mistakes. And with the voice, it's, as you said, the hardest medium to convey anything in, because if your voice breaks or you are off pitch, it's very personal. It's not like an instrument as much. So yeah, in terms of spoken word as well as sung word, it's just as vulnerable. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just have a couple of questions from the MEs here, and then I think there was quite a few on the chat. I think quite a few of the MEs are maybe thinking about doing PhDs, and we were wondering maybe like for someone who maybe has an idea that they're wanting to explore, do you think going down the PhD route is a good starting point, or do you think maybe exploring it in different ways first?
I wouldn't say a PhD starting point. It's usually the end point. You should have done given a talk or done a residency somewhere, or written a paper or done an artwork or something, and you have to decide whether you can marry this subject, because it's usually a very long process, and you need to also have your interview for the PhD, and everyone else is getting on with their lives and earning money and doing whatever and going traveling and whatever, and you're married to your subject. So if you haven't tried and tested it before, I would say don't start with a PhD in mind. Test it out in different formats. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be doing my PhD age 34. There's no way that I could have done it when I was at any other stage in my life. I feel too young for it at the moment. I wish that I was 10 years older. Definitely, I appreciate that I have had lots of work experience where the question has emerged from my work, rather than as an abstract concept that has kind of floated around. Yeah, I think that that's really important for me to have kind of gone out into the world and to have sort of developed a practice, and then to use the PhD as a space to question the practice and how the practice can become better. But in a practice-based PhD, you need to have a kind of pretty solid practice anyway, I think, to question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just one more question. in the MAs. So for Fari again, what was the inspiration behind the manic laughter in the tuba piece?
It was just the sort of idea of an instrument, an object of nuisance. What do we have as women traditionally? And we have the power of laughter and derision. That's something we've always had over men. They fear being laughed at. Also, despotic dictators, you know, they take PR and their public image very seriously. You know, it's like graffiti in a way, in a social context. You just get to tear everything down. And I just, I thought of the throat of the tuba. I thought of the voice. I guess my sister was in the right place at the time, and it just was a link I made. It's a very instinctive jump.
Yeah, I love that piece. Yeah, I think that's all the questions. I think, there's quite a few on the chat. Don't know if people want to read out their own questions.
Yes,
Maria was the first question, isn't it?
Maria, do you want to ask a question?
She's put it already in the chat. So while can I answer it because it's for me?
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, I love what we're Maria, I've prepared an answer for you, but can I share my screen to answer the question?
Let me just sound the question as well. Or Maria, do you want to ask the question out loud so we can all kind of hear it as well?
Yeah, I can do it. I guess I was just really interested, particularly in systems for a score, what you did. And I was wondering why you chose the loom to collaborate with, and how did the loom like contribute to the conversation between the audio and visual? It's just.
No, it's a great question. Well, we had Vinyl Factory sort of say they would be interested in the output of the what we were doing inside a recording studio, and I was looking at Emirati weave. Emirati weave, like Palestinian and Iranian, all around that region is very important in their culture, and is a language very close to binary. And so that's the wall of my studio in the UAE. I created these huge totems using screen printing, which is something I'd never used before. So I guess that's back to the last question of the materials, allowing space for experimentation and vulnerability. I had no experience. I had to ask other people to collaborate with me so we could make these. And these are derived from Atari glitch. With Chris had circuit bent his old Atari, which we took out there, and that you can see that the weaving squares are on the album cover. That's the album. There were only 100 that were made, and we posted these squares, which this Syrian boy we were working with had woven on his loom, and we posted them back to Vinyl Factory, and they put them on the album covers. And here they are detailing it. And what we did was we made scores out of the glitch so that people could follow a visual score in a way. That also in these paper prints to me looked like cityscapes, especially on the right. I was really exploring the link between sort of noise visually and noise audibly. There's the recording studio, and there's the Atari on its plinth playing out glitched videos that look very much like the weave. The studio that was in there, the recording studio, went out to other different places to record. These are testimonies about people's in location in the design district. Up on the top right is Emirati Sadu weave, which you can see looks very binary, or at least color coded. And on the left is a Atari glitch that I'd created. It became a print, which went on the back of this sculpture, which is the empty cassette box, to suggest the sounds of the city and the minds of the onlookers. That's it. Stop share. Is that all right?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we had a question, another question from Yusuf. Would you like to ask that question, Yusuf, or do you want me to relay it?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask, I'm Pakistani, and I just wanted to ask specifically, like, what it was about Pakistan that really kind of inspired you to make the piece you did, you showed at the start, and like what kind of engaged you to like and drew you in? I know because obviously you use the environment in your work a lot. So.
Oh, Fari, you're still on mute.
Can I use visuals for that one as well?
Of course, go for it.
Well, I can't go back to my my birthplace of Iran, but in the UAE, I'd seen a lot of things that resonated with me, and in Pakistan, I think it's a lot freer in terms of some senses. So I took thousands of photos, over 2,000, and portraits of people doing different things. It was a way to engage with them. This one's amazing. I took this from the window at Crossroads of a woman in a wheelchair with her children who'd returned from begging to sort of meet for a moment, and they all touched each other so tenderly. It was amazing, and it's outside the walls of a very rich house where they could have no access. It just, you can see the barbed wire on the top, and I brought these photos back and put them in an installation. And we had originally thought, when we'd gone for funding for this show, to call it A Bridge to Pakistan, but that just seemed impossible. So then we just explored the idea of how you can not actually represent anywhere faithfully in sound or visuals. So the show was called Close to Karachi. And I think it, for me, was just an extension of what Iran might have been if I'd been able to go. I did have a ticket, but I was advised not to go. I was going to go to language school there with Chris and do some artworks, but we couldn't go. And so Pakistan was just sort of beautiful and overwhelming. And I think Karachi is obviously the wilder, one of the wilder towns. It was just an easy place to be, and I think a good stepping stone after somewhere like the UAE, which is a lot more contained. Bahrain also proved to be very much a good stepping stone that way. It was beautiful, it was important. That's it. Does that answer enough?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
We've got a question from Fari to Hannah about holding the dial in place. Do you want to ask that question, Fari? No, I'll do it. Question for Hannah. How did you hold the dial in place when lacking and posting little radios to participants? Also, did you put a filter over all the voices to create the nostalgic World War II sound, or did that happen naturally with tapes? Yeah, I was intrigued about that as well.
When packing and posting little radios.
Sorry, I misread that.
I'm afraid I don't have a very interesting answer for this, which is I used electrical tape, which was a bit elasticy and a bit fiddly, and I actually really hate small fiddly things. I find like that I just get incredibly frustrated by anything small and dainty, but I did use electrical tape, and it seems to, I think, just about do the trick with these particular cheapo radios. And no, I didn't use a filter. That is the classic sound of Zoom, because the entire project happened in lockdown, and the people that I was working with had long-term health conditions and were particularly vulnerable, and so everything was recorded in the end via the main script was recorded via Zoom. We did also record everything on tape, but you just could not hear it, you know. A lot of the time it was just you just couldn't listen to 29 minutes of the £10 Argos tape recorders edited together. You know, the amount of processing that would have been required for that to be audible, like it wasn't practical. So we just basically made a kind of point of being like, we tried to record this on tape, but it sounded terrible, so we've recorded it in a different way, and that makes our point for us that tape is not a suitable medium.
It was great. It sounded like it all had this World War II filter on it, and they were all speaking from the past, but it was also very modern the way it was edited. I thought it was lovely.
Thank you. It was kind of interesting for me because people kept calling it a podcast, and there's that part of me that's like, oh, podcast, it's not a podcast, it's my art, you know, which I guess says things about my own internal snobism, you know, like there's nothing wrong with podcasts. I love podcasts. I've made a podcast. I should embrace that, you know.
It's like calling an essay a blog. It's not very.
We've got a question from Finn on the MA to Hannah. Finn, do you want to read your question out, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah, I can do it. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to know a bit more about the amateur radio license that you mentioned at the start. And yeah, because I've never really thought about doing that kind of thing, but it sounded kind of interesting. But yeah, what was the kind of process for getting it, and when do you need to have it? And like, can you work with radio signals or like, you know, or do kind of, yeah, that kind of thing without it? Or is there a gray area with certain things? Or because also as well, I was looking at on your website and I was interested with the and maybe it's the second question as well, the VLF kind of signal pickup thing you made, and but I guess that's different to working with radio signals because you're more kind of picking up. But I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that piece as well.
Yeah, I could have actually done the entire presentation just about my work with building antennas, because that's really my kind of current interest. So I kind of veered towards the research rather than that. But, you know, very briefly, the amateur radio license was, I think, is really interesting at the moment, because so many amateur radio enthusiasts have been self-isolating during lockdown. And so the airwaves are absolutely buzzing with people making contacts. So when people make contacts via amateur radio, then they go to a particular frequency, which has been allocated to non-commercial purposes just for amateur radio enthusiasts. And they put out a CQ call where they say, hello, is anyone there? And then if someone else is there, then literally they say, my signal is 5 and 9, your signal is 5 and 9. So basically give a report on how clearly they can hear, despite the fact this might be someone who is living in Pakistan, you know, and they have an opportunity to have a conversation with someone in Pakistan, but they don't. They just say, how clear is my signal? And then they hang up, and then they move on, and then they log it. So I thought that was a really interesting dynamic to explore artistically. And so I was quite interested in social kind of elements of amateur radio, which is why I was determined to get my license. It was incredibly difficult for me because I don't know anything about science, and it was completely not the way in which I learned to memorize a fact. Like I had not had to do that since school. I found it really difficult. You can get your amateur radio license almost for free if you're willing to do the work. You can get it at any amateur. So you have to look on a website called the Royal Society RSGB of Great Britain, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and they've got a list of all the different radio clubs that offer courses. The one nearest to me in Southeast London was called Cray Valley Radio Club. And it's basically like maybe 50 men of retirement age, quite posh, living in Eltham, where they meet in a church hall once a month. And they also run these courses for new amateur radio enthusiasts. It's really, really dry. It's incredibly dry, which is why, you know, us and our feminist collective are trying to now like think about new ways in which to offer this kind of information through more creative and accessible means. But, you know, you live in Eltham, great, Fari, you know, if you want to join our collective, do not go to this amateur radio society. I'm sorry.
I'm going, you're coming.
It's so bad.
I'm coming. We did some amateur radio, some ham radio in UAE, and like you, I was so surprised. It's just a constant checking whether you're there, and then later it occurred to me they're basically preparing for the apocalypse.
Yeah,
because they want to make sure the connections are all open, so if something happens, they're going to be the people that we need, so we must go and see them.
Yes,
I can't believe they're in Eltham. We must go.
Yeah, Cray Valley Radio Society. So so you do need to have a license to transmit. You do not need to have a license to receive. And that's why I've been focusing on building radio receivers, such as the one in the Sound Camp workshop in a couple of weeks' time. So you can learn to make a radio receiver there. The VLF antenna receivers that I've been making, I made an artwork, or in fact, I made a few how-to guides for how you can make radio receivers. Some of those are on my website. You can email me if you can't find them, but you can make them out of basically big loops of copper wire. So VLS stands for very low frequency. So it's a particular part of the radio spectrum that, for example, submarines communicate on, and you can hear also natural radio, the Earth's natural radio. If you're around at LCC tomorrow, I just made a piece for Mark for his Listening Earth Day, And it's a 10-minute audio piece that basically tells you how to make a VLF antenna. I'll post it on SoundCloud after tomorrow as well, if you want to have a listen. But if you don't want to go through the hassle of making a radio, if you don't want to go through the hassle of getting a license, what you can also do is you can listen to software-defined radio on the internet. And so that is a website which has got an antenna stuck into a piece of software, which then puts the entire radio spectrum onto the internet for you to scroll through. But it's a really crap old website. So I've made a how-to guide that I'm going to post in the chat now for how to listen, what it means, what you're listening to, and how to get good sounds out of it. So that's now in the chat.
Amazing, thank you.
That is amazing. That's totally amazing. It's very one thing that struck me today from both talks was about, you know, where or what is the status of a work within practice, you know, whether it sort of rests between the object or the process, or the kind of maybe the more hidden sides that we often have in our practice to do with maybe it's sketching, maybe it's a kind of under this umbrella of a hobby, thinking of amateur as well. And I think the root of that meaning is for the love of it, which I kind of really like as a practitioner to kind of remember that. And there's some really interesting crossovers as well around collaboration and play and politics that I think we could probably open up a whole like other seminar kind of meeting on. And we have to end in 1 minute. I want to ask a very quick question to Fari, if I can, just before we go, which is about the hint of the sort of new research, or the research that you're working on now around noise pollution and sort of cities and smart technologies and things. I'm just very curious and intrigued. Is there a little bit more you could say about that before we have to go?
A bit more about the PhD?
Yeah, that relationship. If you could just sort of explain where what that is, that kind of idea of like noise pollution, and from what I understand, it's more to do with sort of electric phenomena, smart devices.
That's right. It's a hypothesis that the density of wireless signals are present in our furniture, in our clothes, in our transport mediums, and everything will create a new kind of disturbance that's not necessarily audible in any way, or perhaps not even noticeable. But then to redefine hearing and suggest that on some level we will be listening corporeally and affected in some subtle way, and even if that's not going to happen, the possibility that it's there needs to be investigated before we hurtle into smart cities. So it's a kind of I'm lucky because as an arts PhD I don't have to answer the question. Nobody can answer the question really at the moment, but I think it was something in the field of quantum biology that really triggered me, and they just discovered a new cell, or a new protein in robins that help them to navigate the Earth's curvature using the natural radio waves of the planet, and that protein allowed them to see where they were going, and we have that protein as humans in our eyes. So it was there as an open door to me to suggest that perhaps we don't understand enough about the body and about smart cities. And so it's listening on a very subliminal level.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to end very shortly. Just a quick one to Hannah. With the question from the MAs around PhDs, just because you're here and you did do the MA and you are now doing the PhD, how long was the gap, regardless of how old we're all getting in various ways? What was the actual time gap between the MA and starting the PhD? Like, how many years was that?
12 years, but I did the MA when I was like straight off my BA. So I was 21. And I think that for me, that made a big difference. I was not a mature 21-year-old. I know that it isn't all about age, but for me, it really was, you know? So it's been 12 years that I've been, focusing and developing a practice that I'm now interrogating.
Great, cool. I hope that helps a little bit, Beth, as well with that question, because I think historically there is quite big gaps between an MA and the PhD, as Hannah just sort of said. Okay. That was incredibly inspiring. Thank you, Fari. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Beth. That was brilliantly facilitated. Loved it.